Section James.
Aloha. My name is Laura Theilen. I'm testifying before you today as an individual. I did serve as the chairperson of the Department of Land and Natural Resources from July 2007 until December 2010. I have not spoken publicly about the business of DLNR since that time because I wanted to show this administration and this chairman the same respect the previous chairman had given me. But my concerns over the Public Land Development Corporation have grown so great that I feel compelled to step forward. I support the repeal of Act 55. I will work next session towards repealing Act 55, but I understand that you do not have the authority to repeal that act. You are a board that's been appointed under that act, and your job is to perform the function of that act. So what I'm going to limit my comments to today is a proposed 7 changes to your administrative rules. But I'd like to begin with some context to explain the reason for my recommendation. During the early days of statehood, the predecessor of DLNR was created for the purpose of developing state land in order to develop the state economy. If you look at the original enabling legislation for DLNR, DLNR was a land development agency. Over the next few decades, development flourished, often at the expense of our resources and our communities. Our state economy grew, but unfortunately, an insatiable appetite for development and the significant money it brings also grew unchecked. In time, residents of Hawaii rebelled and advocated to change Hawaii's laws. In the following decades, our state adopted many new laws which have clearly redefined a new, modern, and more relevant mission for the Department of Land and Natural Resources. And that is a mission of conserving, protecting, and enhancing Hawaii's natural and cultural resources. Up until last year, DLNR was an agency governed by a single board. The Board of Land and Natural Resources was exclusively tasked with balancing the modern mission, conserving our natural resources for future generations, with the old laws authorizing DLNR to develop state land. I can tell you that this balance can be challenging. But in recent years, I was very proud to be a part of the board clearly shifting DLNR to focus more on resource conservation as the primary mission. DLNR development up until now has been limited to minor projects that support DLNR's base operations like parks, small boat harbors, fencing native forests, or a select few larger projects in already urbanized areas that were built in compliance with federal, state, and county permitting, zoning, and land use laws. Last year, the legislature adopted a law that completely shatters the concept of balance. By creating the PLDC, the legislature effectively severed any connection between the mission of resource conservation and the development of state land. Now there are 2 completely disconnected boards. The PLDC is tasked with a mission to develop state land to generate revenue. Some lip service is given to supporting DLNR, but the reality is this board's mission is to develop state land in a manner that maximizes revenue, period. The PLDC has no obligation to balance the interest of resource conservation, no obligation to have projects meet land use or county zoning laws, and no obligation to ensure that the Board of Land and Natural Resources supports these projects. We are being told we should support the PLDC because it will generate revenue for DLNR. As a former chair of the Department of Land and Natural Resources, I can tell you unequivocally the PLDC is taking revenue away from DLNR and will continue to do so. Under law, PLDC is taking a 15% cut plus administrative costs out of any development revenue. That is taking 15% of those revenues away from DLNR. In addition, this board apparently does not have to abide by the public bidding or lease limitations on DLNR, opening the door to sweetheart deals that may generate revenue, but not for DLNR. Equally worrisome are the comments of the executive director of PLDC in this morning's paper, where he stated that the PLDC's, quote, objective is to provide the alternative funding that will make programs self-sufficient. So does this mean that the intent of the PLDC is to defund DLNR of all general fund revenues and leave it on more unstable footing? All this background begs the question, if someone is purely interested in just supporting DLNR, why create a redundant board that siphons revenue away from this department? It appears to me that the PLDC was created by interests who do not like the fact that the development of state land has been managed by a board that has to balance resource conservation with generating revenue, and instead preferred to create a new board that was unfettered by any obligation to balance resource conservation. Again, I realize that you did not introduce this legislation. However, as the board, you control the administrative rules that are adopted that govern this board. And you have to understand that when you adopt these rules, you are not adopting rules that just bind you. Because you don't know who the next chairman of this department will be, or the next, or the next, or the next. And can you trust their judgment the way that you trust your own? You have to write these rules for perpetuity. So I suggest the following 7 amendments: that the PLDC follows certain procedures and commitments. First, the PLDC will seek the Board of Land and Natural Resources approval of any project involving the development of state land. Work with the board that needs to deal with the mission of conservation of resources. Second, the PLDC will not seek to develop agricultural lands eligible for designation as important agricultural lands. Third, the PLDC will voluntarily abide by state land use and county zoning laws, and any projects that require an exemption or amendment to such will follow the established procedures. You can voluntarily bind yourself to follow the laws. And that would include Robert Harris's suggestion that if any EA or EIS finds that a project has significant impacts, that the PLDC will not pursue such projects. Fifth, the PLDC will be responsible for providing OHA with any ceded land revenue and will not shirk that responsibility or transfer it to DLNR or any other state agency. Sixth, that 95% of the revenue generated goes to DLNR and that all PLDC administrative costs are limited to 5%. And lastly, the draft rules include provisions that authorize the PLDC to make investments in securities, including providing seed capital even when no other professional investor is involved. I'd ask that you eliminate any provision authorizing investments because it's fiscally irresponsible to allow this board to use state funds to engage in speculative trading. My last recommendation isn't related to the administrative rules, but rather a lesson I think we should learn from what happened with the rail project recently. The city went ahead and engaged in a number of contracts and obligations that provided for additional costs and fines if those projects did not go forward. And the public has been extremely upset by that because it was foreseeable at the time of the contracting that the project may be stopped. You've heard a lot of testimony tonight that many of us will be seeking the repeal of Act 55 in front of the legislature next session. I would ask that this board not go forward with any projects or any commitments until after we get through next session, because it would be irresponsible to reach obligations that you cannot meet come 2013. Thank you.